Welcome to Anarchic Areopagita. Today is Thursday, August 13th. My name is John Weeks. I'm joined tonight by the great Jim Jatras, former United States diplomat and foreign policy advisor for the United States Senate Republican leadership. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, John. Great to be here with you.
It's great to have you. Would you like to uh, sort of extrapolate on my introduction? I know you've got a much more uh, storied career than I presented it as.
No, that's pretty much it. After I got out of law school, knew I didn't want to practice law. I went into the diplomatic service, served in Mexico, and then at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, and then at the Office of the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. And then for more than 17 years, I worked at the Republican leadership, the Policy Committee in the U.S. Senate on mostly on foreign policy work. And then I left government service in 2002 and was an evil Washington lobbyist for several years, and then I retired, and now just a Virginia country gentleman.
Excellent. It's always nice for me personally to meet good people like yourself who have experience within the government, because I feel that within libertarian circles, it's easy to just demonize the state, think of it as just a monster that's going to eat us, and to lose sight of the fact that there are people within the government who are good people who are trying to fight the good fight, who are, um, just as human as the rest of us civilians. And it's also really great to get their perspective. Um, People outside of government, it's easy to just dream up the most paranoid fantasies about what's going on, and maybe what's going on is worse than your fears. But it's always nice to get the actual, insider perspective.
Well, sometimes it is worse than your fears because every structure like that takes on a life of its own, regardless of the individuals that you find in it. And some of that is the nature of institutions of government itself. Some of that is the whatever the ruling ideology is, whether it's democratic capitalism or fascism or communism or whatever it is. And you're going to have, notwithstanding whatever those proclivities are, you're still going to have human beings in the middle of them, in the middle of it, some good, some bad, some indifferent. I guess I was always, even inside the belly of the beast, a little bit of a dissident, if you will, the Christian in Diocletian's court, who is trying to do the right thing under very adverse circumstances. That's partly because why my book is called I Tried to Warn You, because I think a large part of what I did, especially in those years at the Senate, was to say on any number of things, whether it was South Africa or Central America or the Balkan Wars or the lead up to the Iraq War, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. Of course, you can see how much influence I ended up having, right?
Why do you think that the bad idea from your perspective, and I think I would share that perspective, why do you think the bad idea is consistently the one that is pursued?
I think, well, I'm not a libertarian ideologically. I think perhaps you are. And I think there is a strong element of truth in the libertarian perspective that the nature of government is to dominate, to destroy, to crush. War is the health of the state. That's part of the nature of the beast. And the bigger and more fat it grows, the more it displays those tendencies. Now, you have to read into that not only the nature of government or bureaucracy or institutions, uh, ipso facto, but also the specific ideological coloration that it comes with. And I think that's partly the story of the 20th century, that after European Christian civilization decided to commit auto-genocide in 1914, that all the crazies got let out of the cupboard and took over. And we have then all sorts of, I don't want to even dignify with philosophy. I guess ideology is the best word I can think of. Ideological assumptions about the world, ideologies that people want to impose on everybody else, that are now baked into the cake. They're part of the way our government works. And one reason why we're in the mess we are now, not only in the Ukraine situation, but obviously now in Iran, no doubt coming up soon in a confrontation with China, that we are the people who run things in Washington, or at least in their aggregate, not necessarily the individuals involved, have no other way to look at the world except through their ideological lens, which is kind of a Manichean lens. It's very similar in some ways to what communism was. That that all morality is kto kovo. It's all whom. It's all subjective. There is no objective morality. That's one reason why, for example, that you'll find over and over again in these conflicts, we will make the most horrendous accusations against the countries that we are directing aggression at, while we give ourselves a mulligan on everything. Oh well, we're not bound by the same rules that we demand everybody else observe. Well, why is that? Well, because we have a Manichean worldview. By definition, we're good. By definition, they're bad. So everything we do is good, no matter what the objective nature of our actions are. By the same token, everything they do is bad, no matter what the objective nature of their behavior. So that's the world we find ourselves in now, and have for, especially since the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, when the external restraint on our state was released, and they say, base, great, we can rule the world now. And our one ideology, the Fukuyama end of history, is we're now the midwife of history, as the Soviet Union purported to be in its day.
Two thoughts to that, one about institutions and one about ideologies. Um, Daryl Cooper, who co-hosts podcast Provoked with my boss, Scott Horton, in a recent episode, he was talking about a U.S. Navy ship that was notorious in the Navy for having a really bad crew, just terrible morale,
Mm-hmm.
people screwing everything up, um, no real discipline on the ship. It had that reputation throughout the Navy. But the crazy thing was that you'd go, visit that ship and experience the mess that it
Yeah,
was. Then you go there 10 years later and it's a whole new crew, but it's the same culture because the guys that showed up
yeah.
were just brought into that culture. Um, so I'm interested to know like how you experienced the DC culture or the specific cultures you were in as a diplomat. And then alongside that, speaking about ideology, one idea that our mutual friend Tommy Salmons has got me into is the idea that of thinking of an ideology as a spirit that possesses someone. And similar to the idea of institutions, you can have an ideology possessing people 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're all dead. You have all these new people in these new institutions, or the same institutions, but they've been possessed by the same ideology. So, how did you experience the culture of DC or the diplomatic service? And what would you say were the dominant ideologies or the dominant ideology?
I don't know how esoteric you want to get on this. I don't know
Oh,
if
you can
you've
get as
heard of
esoteric as you want.
I don't know if you've heard a book called The New Science of Politics by Eric Vogelin that was published in 1952. I remember reading it at the beach about 30 years ago, and it made a big impression on me. And what he talks about is the Gnostic temptation that's inherent in Western civilization. He identifies it with the death of the divination of nature that existed in Roman paganism and its replacement with Christianity. And again, not just as simple as that, but that Gnostic tendency was built into the the system of European Christian civilization, and became stronger and stronger and stronger with each passing century. There would be an outbreak of Gnosticism in some form, and then it would be beaten back and then come back even stronger in the next century or 2 centuries. And you could trace this through history. And I think there's something to that. There's that spirit, and you can speculate where that spirit comes from and what the nature of it is, but it is self-perpetuating and it can migrate from one place to another. The French scholar Alain Besançon likened it to a kind of parasite, he likened it to what is the riverborne worm disease that comes from drinking contaminated water, and you drink it in and the worm forms inside the human being, and then it's urinated back out into the river, and it circulates that way, that it can jump from one host to another, changing its external, from a worm to a whatever it is, other kind of nymph, or what's the word, what a larva or something like that. And I think something similar to that happens in ideology, especially during the 20th century, where you had Gnostic ideologies like Marxism, Leninism, like fascism. I think we like to think that in our country we had no such ideology. We just had democracy and capitalism, right? No, no, no. We had an ideology too, that where the Soviet Union had peace, progress, and socialism, we have democracy, human rights, and free markets, right? As defined by the managerial class, and with the same kind of flexibility to redefine terms as it suits the needs of power. And I think that's sort of what we have. That, in a sense, and by the way, you can find this even more strikingly, as we know, from the existence of the neoconservatives in the so-called conservative movement in the United States. I mean, these are people who actually had been communists in their original ideological orientation, mainly of a Trotskyite point of view, who then somehow became conservatives, and over the course of time became the dominant strain of conservatism, so called, in the Republican Party. And how does that happen exactly? How can that transfer occur that was communism under Max Schachman in the 1930s becomes conservatism in the Bush and even now in the Trump administration?
When you were in the foreign service and you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing these ideologies infect and spread
Yeah.
throughout the government, um, what was the culture like? How often did people say that we're an empire and we should dominate, or we're the hegemon and we should dominate, or if it's not us, it'll be somebody else? Or how much was that like sublimated into like,
In those terms, very rarely. I mean, when I came into the Foreign Service in 1978, I think that was during a period of transition. First off, back in those days, everybody assumed the bipolar world was permanent, that communism was permanent, and this was just the state of affairs. And I was not of that opinion. When I went to the Soviet desk in 1981, I was notable for being probably the only real ideological anti-communist in the whole damn desk, as far as I can tell. Everybody else, after all, back in those days, a lot of people believed in basically convergence, the similarities of the two systems, that they were both progressive, they were both secular, they were both internationalist. I mean, we basically had the same, the ideology of these people and of the Soviet leadership were like two species of the same genus, the same kind of assumptions about how the world works, with a few different terms. Okay, fine. Ours is based on a corporate structure. Theirs is based on a single state corporation. What's the real difference? All right. And the only bad thing about the Soviet Union wasn't communism. It was the fact, oh, those Russians, they just screw everything up. They did, they made a bad job of a good ideology, which is one reason, by the way, that I, again, naive young fellow that I was in the early 1990s, I kind of assumed that when communism fell in the Soviet Union, hey, it was Miller time. All the craziness from World War One and the aftermath was finally over. We can get past all that 20th century ideological nonsense, go back to kind of a normal world that existed before 1914, and go about building, a peaceful civilization again. What I didn't realize is that things were a lot more ideological on our side than I thought they'd been. They were not just normalcy. Um, and we saw this in particular with respect to the former Soviet Union, that people who had been not necessarily pro-Soviet, but not particularly anti-Soviet and not at all anti-communist, suddenly became raving Russophobes. when Russia ceased to be a communist country, which they didn't find particularly unattractive, and became a national, even somewhat Christian oriented society, that was intolerable. That then they became very very hostile. I found that surprising because I did not expect that. It took me a few years, especially through the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, to realize what was really going on.
William Pupert, who is the military affairs analyst at the Libertarian Institute,
Mm-hmm.
he likes to say that the Western elite will never forgive Russia for abandoning communism.
I think it's absolutely true, which is in a way why we get this almost bizarre inversion of roles, where it's this Russia, which is now the normal national power, simply trying to pursue its state interests as they see it, national interests as they see it, and we're the ones with the global ambition, with the one and only true ideology that all of mankind must follow, or other evil must be destroyed. And it's almost like we're the new Soviet Union now, the USSA that has this ideological mission, global democracy, and whatever other nonsense we want to, whatever nonsense label we want to have hang on it.
When I interact with geopolitics and read about foreign policy, um, I always try to stay focused on the fact that I am an American. This
Mm-hmm.
is my nation.
Yeah.
I'm patriotic. I I've been marinated in the ideologies and the propaganda, and when I see like U.S. soldiers coming home in flag draped caskets, I get upset. Um, so I'm not one of these people who has this the Manichean view, and then suddenly it flips. I know people like this who
Yeah.
they bought into the narrative that we're good and the other side's pure evil. And then when they realized that that was they're being lied to, they said, "Oh, it must be that the other side is pure good and we're pure evil."
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it is just when I read about Russian society versus the demonization from the Western managerial class and its media, it does seem like in a lot of ways it's a less crazy nation than ours and like a healthier nation in a lot of ways. Like we have this deep sickness
Mm-hmm.
in our country. And I mean, I'm on our side. I'm an American. If the Russian tanks roll in, like hand me a nine. But it does seem like, yeah, a big part of this is that Russia wanted to be a normal and, as you said, Christian oriented nation. And the fact that that is intolerable to our elite, just, you know, that sort of that's a data point that supports some people's claim that like we're ruled by Satanists.
You mean there's something to this whole Epstein thing that I haven't noticed? I mean, but and by the way, you're right about that kind of black and white thinking we have about good guys and bad guys, and maybe that's partly from our American culture. Westerns, white hat, black hat. There's two sides. Who's the good guy? I remember all the way back, whether it was the Balkan Wars, whatever. The first question I'd hear from people who knew nothing about it, where they were, they wanted to know who the good guys and the bad guys were. It was as simple as that. And the idea that you have people subjectively pursuing what they see as their own interests and what they believe to be right, and then those visions clash. And maybe there are some merits on both sides and maybe some flaws on both sides. That's something that does not come naturally, I think, to Americans. They just want to know who the good guys are and the bad guys are. And of course, we're always the good guy. And that's the other thing, too, is that if you even hint that, well, gee, maybe we did something to help precipitate this, they can't. Well, you're anti-American. No, I'm not fond of the American empire because I think it's creating a danger to the American people and it's not helping our peace or prosperity. But in fact, I think that the empire must fail if we want to get our country back in any meaningful sense and not just make us a footstool for somebody else's global ambitions. But I think this kind of black and white, good guys, bad guys thing is across the board. I mean, okay, right now there are a lot of people on the dissident, both dissident right and dissident left, who are very upset about the war in Iran, Israel, sort of as they feel leading us around by the nose and all that kind of stuff. But then they'll turn around and say, well, that must mean that, all the Islamic forces in the Middle East, they must just be a bunch of, peaceful, cuddly kittens. Well, no, I've been around for 1,400 years of jihad. It's not a pleasant picture. I mean, just because one side has an inordinate influence on our policy and and they have people they would like us to go out and destroy, doesn't mean that everything on that side is all sweetness and roses and baby unicorns either. And so I think we need to try to even with ideologies I don't like or regimes I don't like, I think you have to try to take a step back and say, okay, where are they coming from? What are their limited goals? Some of which may be legitimate, maybe not. Where do they conflict with our legitimate interests, not our ideological global interests? And how can we try to manage this in a way that's least harmful to all sides? And by the way, we used to be able to do that to some extent. 1955, when we had the State Treaty of Austria, where because people forget that there was a four-power occupation of Austria, like there was with Germany after World War II. Berlin, Vienna was divided up the same way that Berlin was, and the Soviet Union, United States, Britain, and France agreed on reuniting Austria as a neutral state, and it was useful to both sides, and they abided by that agreement. That kind of thing is unthinkable today. Unthinkable. Because it would mean we would admit that our ideological opponents have legitimate interests. And we don't know how to do that anymore.
We're talking about uh, good guys and bad guys in the Balkan Wars. I remember in real time paying attention to the American war in Kosovo and the bombing of Belgrade.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, this seems not right. I remember watching a press conference with a U.S. general. I think he was a general at, I think, the Pentagon. And he was like, he's like, yeah, so there have been some irresponsible, like, I'm paraphrasing from memory. There have been some irresponsible reports that we bombed a train. I have this video footage to dispel these rumors. And he plays the footage and it shows a train getting bombed. And he's like, oh, I guess we did bomb a train. Well, I'm sure there was a good reason for this or moving on. And I was like, what? And I just remember thinking, like, okay, you're demonizing Milosevic. He doesn't seem like a good guy to me. But you
Mm-hmm.
guys don't seem like the good guys either. So that kind of like made sense. But then there's these earlier Balkans wars, and like they've like never made sense to me until now. I'm not going to say they make sense, but I'm starting to kind of understand it because
Mm-hmm.
in Scott Horton's latest book, Provoked, he does a whole treatment on that period of history. It's still super confusing. I've gone
Oh,
back and read it like 4 or 5 times. And I'm like, I got to read some more books on this and talk to people about it. But it's like, but my big takeaways though were you've got DC had its post Soviet agenda, like you said, very ideological,
mm-hmm.
very
Yeah.
driven on global dominance. NATO had its own bureaucratic agenda. The elite politicians in Britain, Germany, and France,
Mm-hmm.
especially, but throughout Europe, had their own domestic political um, incentives to look tough. There's an element of, hey, we owe one to the Muslims. There's a whole lot of
Yeah.
crazy tributaries flowing into it. But I just think like, wow, this is really a good, representative
Mm-hmm.
situation of empire because it's so confusing that like even though I like know basically what happened, I still don't know what happened.
Well, being somebody who by blood is a Balkan denizen myself and has some acquaintance with all this stuff, even I don't fully understand it. I mean, it reminds me of what somebody once said about the Schleswig-Holstein problem. And he says there are only three people in the history of the world who understood the Schleswig-Holstein problem. One died, one went mad thinking about it, and the third one was me, but I forgot what it was. And so that's sort of the way the Balkans are too. I mean, even and it's very hard for anybody to talk about it without being, a little bit of, well, from our side's point of view, and then from their side's point, at the beginning of the Balkan crisis in June of 1991, I wrote a policy paper, which is part of my job at the policy committee, on, well, there's all this relatively peaceful decommunization of Eastern Europe is about to hit a speed bump because Yugoslavia is about to blow up, and here's why. And I realized I was wading into a snake pit, and that the only way I could try to explain it in a way that made sense without seeming to take sides, because I really didn't want to, was to try to tell it through subjective terms. Here's what the Serbs think, and here's why they think it based on their experience. Here's what the Croats think and why they think it based on their experience. Here's what the Slovenes and the Albanians and so on and so forth, the Bosnian Muslims think. And that's the way I wrote the paper. And at that time, our papers had to be reviewed by the Republican leader's office, Bob Dole's office. And I was told by a staffer in that office, no, no, I couldn't write the paper that way. I had to write the paper that the Serbs were communists and everybody else were pro democracy and pro American. That's the way the paper had to read. And I really couldn't write the paper that way. Obviously, I basically called back some of the material I put in and then insisted that it be issued without my name because I couldn't stand by the way the paper had been written at that point. But that was the mindset at the time. Now, of course, you also had very strong, people talk about the Jewish lobby in Israel, all that. Yeah, that's the 800-pound gorilla, but trust me, it ain't the only one. I mean, you got the Saudis and the Turks and the Indians and the Pakistanis. And at that time, you had of course, during the South Africa sanctions thing, you had the Black Caucus and all that. They were very, very big at that time. It was domestic politics. At the time of the Balkan Wars, you had strong Croatian and Albanian lobbies. They had a lot of money. The Serbs were flat on they pathetic. They had no kind of lobby at all because they always assumed that America was, well, we were on America's side during World War II, so they'll be on our side, right? No, no. We basically adopted all the Axis allies from World War II. Hey, wait a minute, we're doing that in Ukraine too. Well, how odd is that? Anyway, it was, there's a lot of that goes on behind the scenes. Like there used to be these. I don't know if you've heard of like the captive nations groups that existed around Washington during the Cold War. These are basically ethnic lobbies from Croatia and Czechia and Slovakia and Hungary and places like that, and they basically were sold to the Republican Party in particular, but also to the Democrats as good anti-communists. They're with us against the Soviet bloc. But what they really were was more like a World War II losers association. What they basically were saying, we like the borders of 1943 better than the borders that were emerged in 1945. And after everything fell apart, yeah, the borders today look more like the borders of 1943 than the borders of 1945. And so it was kind of a revisionist thing based on ethnic agendas that most regular old non-hyphenated Americans are totally clueless about. I mean, if you try to tell that most Americans involved in policy, well, why are these people advocating this and that? Well, they're standing up against the Soviet Union and communism. No, they're not. They just want these provinces back that they thought belonged to them and not to those guys over there. And that's all it's really about. And most Americans wouldn't have a clue about that.
You mean to suggest that our Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, might be making policy decisions based on his Cuban descent?
No, no. Really? Joe, say it ain't so. Yeah, I can remember Warren Christopher when his Secretary of State back under was that under initially the Clinton years? I can't remember now. But when the war broke out in Bosnia, and obviously you had Bosnian Serbs, Croats, and Muslims fighting each other. Also, all basically the same people, by the way, only differing in their religion, which is how their communities are defined, kind of like in Lebanon. And he was asking Serbs, how'd they get over into Bosnia? He evidently did not know that they were the second largest ethnic group in Bosnia. And actually, before World War II, they had been the largest ethnic group in Bosnia, but now they're the second largest after World War II based on some bad stuff that happened during the war. When was he Secretary of State? Are you looking it up now? Warren Christopher?
Oh, I didn't. You want me to?
Oh, no, it doesn't matter. I was just trying to, my memory fails me at my age, so I was trying to remember when he was, I think he was the beginning, Secretary of State at the beginning of the Clinton years, but I could be wrong about
Oh,
that.
up right now.
There's one other funny thing, John, is that there was when I got into the State Department, the remnant of the old WASP aristocracy that you still found around the department. They were kind of like fossils in those days. They were kind of like a legacy from the earlier days. The kind of people you'd find like Averill Harriman, or who was the guy with the containment? Uh, um, oh gosh, I slipped my mind now. Who was the guy came up to contain the document at the end at the beginning of
Mr.
the Cold
X.
Mr. X, yeah. What was his real name? I forget now, and just slipped my mind. But you had people like that who had this kind of old Yankee view of who America was and what our interests were, and it really was a lot more sane than what came later. I guess I was part of the bad crowd that came in later that really, didn't know its butt from a hot rock when it came from American history and values. And you know, a lot of those guys had some pretty level heads, and there were just fewer and fewer of them as time went on.
So Warren Christopher was Secretary of State from 1993 to
Yeah.
1997.
Oh, really? That late?
And Mr. X is George Kennan.
George Kennedy. Yeah, that's the name. Yeah, yeah. I am getting old.
I forgot his name too. It's easy. It's an easy name to forget. We should not judge ourselves
No,
on our
no, and,
age.
and even of course at the end of the Cold War, he was one of the strongest people warning against NATO expansion and the rest of it. I mean, we haven't got to Ukraine yet, but I think what we need to establish as a sort of baseline is this is not about Ukraine. It's not about Ukraine at all. I mean, my go-to piece that I point people to is the 1996 article in Foreign Affairs magazine by Robert Kagan, aka Mr. Victoria Nuland, and William Crystal, called Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy, where they called for the United States to exert what they called benevolent global hegemony forever, that the United States should dominate the world, impose a system of democratic capitalism on the whole world. And if the Russians and the Chinese don't like it, we should take it as a compliment. And they said that in so many words. And that to me was not so much that that was the blueprint people followed, but it was an expression of the vision of the establishment in Washington of how we should conduct the world at the end of the Cold War, rather than saying, okay, fine, the Cold War's over, Russia's returning to a normal country past, communist ideology. We should return to something like a pre-World War I concert of powers that can keep the peace in the world. That would naturally mean recognizing that other powers have to have a sphere of influence, just like we have in the Western Hemisphere, where you're not necessarily kicking everybody in that sphere around, but you're saying that this doesn't concern you. We need to have our safety zone here where other powers are not going to insert themselves at the expense of our security. Just like we told other powers, since we were a pipsqueak little country in the early 19th century, we don't want you here in the Western Hemisphere. And obviously, and like I said, naively, I thought that's the kind of world that would emerge. It didn't occur to me that this vision would manifest itself. And I think one important uh, way it did manifest itself was to say, look, Russia has no legitimate national interests other than the ones that we allow them to have. And that means we're going to expand NATO, contrary to the promises that were made at the end of the Cold War, and not only pull in all the countries in Eastern Europe, but also the former republics of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, and then Ukraine and Georgia, as declared at the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit. And that was the casus belli for Moscow. They said, look, we cannot allow this. We've the first NATO expansion, Czechia, Poland, and Hungary, the Russians weren't in a position to object to, and they didn't really object to it that much, even though it was a violation of the assurances we gave to them. Um, they um, they uh, they swallowed 2004 the big bang of all the other countries in Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. I think the thing that really rang their bell, though, was the 1999 war against Serbia over Kosovo. Because I can remember people on the Russian side telling me, people have been lifelong anti-communists, saying we never believed all the lies that communists used to tell about how aggressive you are, but now we know that they're all true. And what do you do with that? I mean, that's the thing that really woke a lot of people up over there. And I think at that point, I don't know how. Anyway, back to the Ukraine thing. That's then when we then insisted through not only the Orange Revolution of 2004, 2005, but then to the Maidan Revolution in 2014 to 15, that Ukraine must be dragged kicking and screaming into the Western camp, even though it was a very, very divided country. I mean, the Western part, because the Ukraine is really not a single country, because of its historical experience, is a very disparate country in terms of cultural and religious and ideological influences, with very consistently, they make our red states blue states look like all, kumbaya and holding hands. That in the western part of the country, even as something simple, whose side were you on in World War II? You're going to have very different attitudes in Ukraine, and if you try to force it either into one camp or the other, you're going to rip the country apart, which is what happened. Now, we didn't care, because all we cared was to bring Ukraine into the Western camp as a salient against the Russians. Because if we can get Ukraine into NATO, either formally or even de facto, that makes Russia's security position almost unsustainable. And that's obviously the goal of what we're trying to do. And then, of course, that's, excuse me, what prompted the Russian move to take Crimea, which, of course, the vast majority of its inhabitants didn't want to be in Ukraine in the first place, and was only handed over to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, and then the south, most of the south and east of Ukraine, which didn't want to be in Ukraine either. So here we are, and now we get into, okay, what warnings did the Russians issue? Why did they decide on this special military operation? What are their goals? How are we fighting this war? The bottom line is, this is still what it was from the beginning, which is to use Ukraine as a weapon against Russia. Uh, Sucking Russia into Ukraine is not inconsistent with that goal. Quite the contrary, it allows us to, people like the late Lindsey Graham and many others saying, "Hey, this is the best deal we've ever made. We're spending some money to kill lots of Russians without getting any Americans killed. What could be better?" And I think that's the name of the game, and has been since the beginning.
As as Scott Horton put it in his book Provoked, from the perspective of the DC political elite, the lives of US soldiers have value to be preserved.
Yeah.
The lives of Russian soldiers have value to be degraded, and the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have no value.
No, no, no. And it's, and I think along those lines, since all we really care about is killing Russian soldiers, we don't even care how lopsided the attrition is. In other words, if it takes 10 Ukrainian dead to kill one Russian, it's worth it to us because we did kill that one Russian.
We're
And
like the
10
bad guy in
Ukrainians,
that movie,
yeah,
like the bad guy in the movie Braveheart, where he's like, shoot the arrows. And they're like, sire, won't we hit our guys? And he's like, yeah, but we'll hit theirs too.
yeah, exactly. Yes.
We'll kill
And
Russians, baby.
yeah, yeah, and that's what it's all about. And and let's look at it in broader historical terms. I mean, with the exception of the far west of Ukraine, Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, places like this that were in Poland before World War II, and then in the Austrian Empire before World War I. Most of the rest of Ukraine, not just eastern Ukraine or central Ukraine, but even most of the west of Ukraine, not the far, far west, but the west of Ukraine, all of that was in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union prior to World War I, pro World War II. Um, that there never had been any particular ideological or ethnic problem between people that they say are Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers. I mean, it's a language continuum. Large part of Ukraine speaks what they call Surzhyk, which is kind of a hodgepodge of Russian. I mean, it's really no different than some places you might find in Spain or France where people have their own, or Germany or Italy where people have their own local language, but they also speak the standard language of the country. People in Italy will speak Veneto or Ligurian or Siciliano or Sardu, whatever it is, but they also speak Tuscan, which is standard Italian. And you can do that. You see that in many other countries. That's essentially what the language situation, there's the idea that Russians and Ukrainians are like, I'll give you an example. When I was at the Soviet desk of the State Department, I used to take early morning classes in Russian from an instructor there who is actually not only Ukrainian but a hardcore Ukrainian nationalist. He believed that Ukrainians and Russians were not only the same nationality, but they even belonged to different races. They were, I mean, genetically different people. And I remember once I met his brother, I said, "Hey, your brother Yuri says that Russians and Ukrainians are completely different races of people. What do you think about that?" And he goes, "Me? I'm Russian." I mean, so they're in the same family, for crying out loud. And the thing is, and I think there's some kind of a ghoulish satisfaction that some people get over this war, not only watching Russians getting killed, but watching Ukrainians getting killed. Because in broad historic terms, they're all Rus. They all come from the same ethnic stock. They're all Orthodox Christians. It'd be kind of like somebody watching our Civil War and saying, if they're wearing gray, wearing blue, who cares? They're both Americans. Let them all die. I'm sure you've heard this, John. Sometimes people look back on World War II and say, what we should have really done was just stand back and let all the Germans and Russians kill each other. The more, the better. I mean, that kind of mentality. Well, let's let the Russians and Ukrainians kill each other. Doesn't matter if we're wearing a Russian, Ukrainian uniform. It's win-win for us, right? And I think that kind of ghoulish attitude is out there.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I didn't see that at first. And so at first I had more resentment against the Ukrainians because they seem so entitled to the wealth of Americans and even dragging us into the war directly and getting us all killed. Um, but to see that the where the elite are just like look down on them
Yeah,
in this racial and cultural sense and hate their Christianity and just are happy to have them dead. It gives me a lot of empathy for the Ukrainians, and it makes me think that, oh yeah, I mean, there definitely could be blowback similar to what happened with the Mujahideen.
yeah, yeah. At least from some of these radical elements. If a lot of this depends on how the war ends and what if any Ukrainian state is left, and that's a whole big question mark. But if there is a collapse of the current Ukrainian state, and by the way, there's a reason why there hasn't been a viable Ukrainian state ever. I mean, this one just sort of popped onto the map in 1991 because of a deal among the Communist Party bosses when they broke up the Soviet Union. But there never had been. There was an attempt to form one in the wreckage of World War One, and that was not viable between the Soviet Union on the one side and Poland on the other. And that, in a way, because there are all these fault lines through it, because it is, as the name implies, simply a borderland, that it is inherently unstable unless it can achieve a very, very delicate balance among these disparate elements. And I don't think that's possible anymore. So I don't see how this state survives. But if it does collapse, yeah, I think some of these crazed elements from like the Azov Battalion, Pravi Sector, and all these goons, they're going to be a problem in a number of countries. And you mentioned Mujahideen. I mean, yeah, we like to manufacture groups like this. We created ISIS, we created Al Qaeda, we created all these crazy groups, and sometimes they do what we tell them to do, and sometimes they slip the leash and do bad things. Well.
I don't know, I think it was either last year or 2 years ago, but I saw Admiral James Stavridis on Morning Joe. I think it was Morning Joe. It was definitely an MSNBC show when it was still called MSNBC. And he was basically like, Ukraine is now one of the most armed or the most armed country in Europe. Like, if they ever became a problem, they could be a real problem. And they all kind of like laughed about it. Yeah. Like, and I could just like see the propaganda 10 years from now.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Ukraine, the new Hitler. They have all these weapons. They've developed drone technology. Like, what? I remember I lived through you guys doing this.
Yeah, it's I always laugh when I see some news story about French or British or American advisors, NATO advisors to the Ukrainian armed forces. I'm thinking, what do those guys know about war more than these Ukrainian guys? I mean, this is, as is the case with many wars, you see this, especially in drone technology, but many other things, these quantum leaps in military technique and technology. And these guys know this for 4 years of war. I mean, aside from the Russians, they're probably the most advanced military force on the planet in terms of their knowledge of modern warfare. What does some Frenchman know about modern warfare? What war has he been in?
Saw some report recently. It was saying that uh, NATO has run war games with the Ukrainians. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
the Ukrainian drone operators against the NATO forces. And
Yeah,
every single time, Ukraine just obliterates them.
absolutely. Sure. Yeah.
I actually had this like thought experiment that I do where it's like, imagine you have a nation, it has a standing military for defense, but it's able to be at peace for like 200 years. So that means that no one in your military has combat experience. And no
Mm-hmm.
one was trained by anyone who has combat experience.
Yeah.
None of the trainers were trained by anyone who has combat experience. Going back generations, someone's going to look at that and be like, this is a national security threat. We should fight a war, get
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
practice. And I know in Colonel Douglas McGregor's book, Warrior's Rage, there's a funny
Mm-hmm.
part where future General H.R. McMaster, as they're in the desert of Saudi before Desert Storm kicks off, he's like a lot of guys around here have a lack of discipline. We need some combat to straighten things out around here. Um, did you ever meet? Is this a big new Brzezinski?
I don't think I did. I knew one of his sons who worked up at the Senate, knew him pretty well, but I didn't know Zbigniew himself.
So he's got the book, The Great Chessboard,
Oh, yeah, I did read that. Yeah, of course.
and basically, if my this is my interpretation, but
Hmm.
basically, Europe is a chessboard, and so the European nations like
Yeah.
Ukraine are the pawns and pieces,
Yeah.
and then the DC and Moscow are the players. And Moscow, Russia is an empire, and you keep seeing you were talking about the in the run up to Russia's special military
Hmm.
operation, there's the NATO enlargement or expansion,
Yeah.
which upsets them, but is a red line when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia.
Hmm.
Um, but then also, people in the West are talking about breaking Russia up into four or five
Yeah.
nations, saying that things like Russia has no right to exist. We need to decolonialize
Yeah.
Russia's internal empire.
Right.
That's funny. So on this side of the chessboard is this empire internally. On the other side is this thing that's either not that most people will say is not an empire, except once
Yeah.
in a while the neocons, or
Yeah.
now people in the Trump administration. I don't know if you saw recently, like maybe days ago, the State Department put out this little video about the Monroe Doctrine.
No, I didn't see that. No.
It's funny. It's like, yeah, like the Monroe Doctrine. That's when we like told European powers they better stop colonizing the Western Hemisphere. That's our sphere of influence. But it doesn't mention any promises that America's not going to meddle in their sphere of
No.
influence.
That was part of Monroe Doctrine too.
They left that out of the State
Yeah, of
Department
course.
video.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure in that video they use words like domination.
Yeah.
Um, so I just think it's funny that okay, we're not, and don't call it an empire, but we're actually more powerful than this thing that you do call an empire. We have more global influence than this thing that you call an empire. It's an internal empire.
Yeah.
Um, Years ago, I was a legislative aide for a state representative in Massachusetts
Hmm.
and had some interesting experiences down at um, Capitol Hill, at the state house. And one thing I learned was that the lobbyists, and you said you were a lobbyist, the lobbyists would like basically write the legislation for
Of
us, or
course.
at least do the
Yeah.
first draft. We might like tweak it a little bit. And then basically like all the power was with the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and the governor and their staff. And they'd basically like give you your marching orders. So I was like, oh,
Mhm.
it's like I always thought of it as the state representative is representing the people like in Boston before the
Right.
government. But it's really the flip side. They're really representing the government
Yeah.
to the people back home. They're like the friendly face of the government. They're likable enough to get elected. They go to the little
Yeah.
league games and they go to the
Hmm.
business openings
Yeah.
and they go to wakes and funerals and weddings. But basically, like 90% or even more when you're new is decided by other people with the lobbyists getting a big say. And then it's like you either spin this to your constituents and get reelected or you don't. And in Massachusetts, it's a supermajority um, Democrat
Hmm.
state in the House and the Senate. So they basically their attitude is like, we don't care if you don't get reelected. Like if you can't hack it, can't hang, fine. We'll find someone who can. And we're
Yeah.
not going to lose our majority just because you can't, spin the the new bill to your people. But I also kind of noticed that as had been reading libertarian literature like a couple years before I did this job. And so one thing that libertarians would talk about is like, isn't it crazy? There's always like new laws being passed.
Hmm.
And so then when I was working there, I got to see a different perspective, which was like, oh, it's like, yeah, if you get elected to the legislature, you you want to pass laws, like you want to come here and do the job.
Hmm.
And the budget is a bill, is a law you're passing with all sorts of not just allocating money for different places, but pushing ideological agendas.
Hmm.
So I think, okay, I wonder if you scale that up, that's what DC is like. These men and women get elected, they get to DC, way complicated.
Yeah.
Like there's Serbs in Croatia, no one knows, but they want to be part of they want to play the game and feel important and pass legislation and like, ooh, war is exciting. Then
Hmm.
you have the lobbyists who are there to like help them. Someone's got to figure out what to do. So the Cuban diaspora is there, like, yo, let's go fight communism. And the Saudis are there, and they're like, yo, we got to do something about these Houthi rebels. And the Israelis are there, and now the Ukrainians are there.
Hmm.
And so this is just what happens when you're an empire. You have spheres of influence. The
Yeah.
nations in those spheres, like they have to go. Yeah, I can empathize with them. They got to go to the imperial court and advocate for their interests, or somebody else is going to advocate against their interests.
Hmm.
Um, and so I see how upset people get about the Israeli influence, like myself included. But then I
Hmm.
wonder to myself, like, are we going to miss the Israelis if Israel, like, if Israel collapses and they all flee to Cyprus and like whatever Miami, and
Yeah, I was just saying they're actually going to come here. That's a whole other story.
this America's their strategic depth. But
Yeah. Good
are we
point.
gonna like
Yeah.
miss them if it's like we still have this empire, but there's no one like the WASPs are gone and the Zionists took over. And then if they're gone, and it's just like the Cubans or something, is it going to be worse? And like this is why you shouldn't be an empire because you start having these thoughts about this horrific situation or this uh, horrific situation. But I do think that like these are lobbyists
Yeah.
for foreign nations
Yeah.
basically. If you remove them and you just have like a truly American first empire, would that actually be worse?
I Short answer is I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned scaling up. I would hope that in Massachusetts, most of the lobbyist interests involved have something vaguely to do with Massachusetts. They're probably like commercial and other economic interests that have a presence in Massachusetts and they care what the Massachusetts legislature does. You probably have some degree of foreign influence. You're probably nowadays, I'm sure the anti-BDS lobbyists are all up there too, trying to get them to pass legislation about boycotting Israel. But by and large, I would think there's something a little closer to the people of Massachusetts. Whereas here, when you do scale it up, you get foreign interests really have nothing to do with the United States at all. Now, literally, just the interests of a foreign country, and also corporate interests that are truly international corporations, global corporations, are not necessarily mainly concerned with the United States or certainly with the prosperity or income levels of the American people, but their corporate transnational corporate interests. Samuel Huntington pointed this out years ago when he said, if we don't know who we are, whose interests are we representing? And I think there's something to that. Yeah, obviously, you can trace when we became an empire. Maybe you at least could take it back to Woodrow Wilson and getting involved in World War One, or even take it back to the Spanish-American War when we decided to enter the world stage by let's find a decrepit empire somewhere we can mug and steal their stuff. Oh, Spain, that looks good. Let's they look like a likely patsy. Let's thunk them on the head and grab all their goodies, which is pretty much what we did. Before that, sure, we had railroad interests, we had mining interests, we had agricultural interests, we had all those interests that had their thumb in the pie back in those days. But at least that had something to do with the United States. I mean, these are mostly internal interests, and that's maybe not representing the American people or even the people of Nebraska or the people of Colorado, but some people somewhere in this country were trying to make a buck at somebody else's expense, right? That's the way the system tends to work. So I'd like to think, oh, well, maybe it was a little more in the family, as opposed to, okay, if we get rid of APAC, who's going to save us from the Muslims in Michigan and the Somalis in Minnesota? And it's not like like I said, the Israeli interests are the 800-pound gorilla, but they're not the only ones. And I think and again, I'm probably some people would disagree with me. I think that's partly because we've lost sight of the idea that America and our constitutional uh, system and our constitutional values were built on a basically British core. English speaking Christians who had this legacy of English self-government from the time of the Magna Carta and all the rest of it. And since we've lost any sense of what an American is anybody who gets a certain piece of paper where his mother happened to drop him after he crossed over the border illegally. We have no idea what an American is. And that's what Huntington said. If we don't know who we are, how can we know what our interests are? And we don't know who we are. So again, back to what I said earlier about a lot of regular old non-hyphenated Americans not having a clue when all these people from Eastern Europe had their own ethnic axes to grind. They really had no idea who these people are and what they were trying to achieve because they themselves did not think in ethnic terms. They had no awareness of their own American ethnic identity, and that having our own country comes with stuff that benefit us, not them, not them, not them. And we've totally lost sight of that.
I like it when Huntington says something like, people like to say that America is a nation of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
Wrong.
Yes.
America is a nation of colonists
Yes.
and immigrants.
And yes, absolutely. Yes.
I was talking to a friend, and she was going on and on about the plight of the indigenous in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just terrible what happened to the indigenous people. All these Europeans came in, um, and they brought diseases, and they conquered them, and then they negotiated treaties with them. But like the indigenous people had a different understanding of what a treaty is. And then I said to her, so would you say this is a good example of the horrific dangers of mass migration? And she was like, I could tell she was upset. And she's like, I never thought of it that way. I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that. What I like to say the nation of immigrants is one of the two great lies foisted upon us. The other one is that this is a civic state, not an ethnic state. That the civic arrangements come from the people. Huntington also wrote that if America had been settled not by British Protestants but by French Catholics or Spanish Catholics or Portuguese Catholics, it wouldn't be America. It would be Quebec or Mexico or Brazil. It would be a different country. And that's something again we've totally lost sight of. I mean, I've done this with lots of people. Okay, fine. I'm a hyphenated American. I understand that. I've been American for 100 years, but I'm a little different from the guys who arrived on the Mayflower or on the Susan Constant or whoever it was. Um, and that if you ask somebody who was a non-hyphenated American, somebody with a Anglo-Saxon name whose ancestors have been here for 400 years, what are you ethnically? He has no idea. He has no idea because let's see, I had a grandmother who was Danish maybe, or was that Dutch? I mean, they look for some other ethnic, you know, flotsam to say, well, maybe I'm kind of like that, even though obviously they're not Dutch, they're not Danish or whatever it is. They're just non-hyphenated Americans, basically an indigenous British American as augmented by various ethnic groups that may have assimilated over the course of time. But if you don't know who you are and what your values are, your history, your institution, how can you even know what your interests are? And I think that's part of our problem now. I mean, when I was a kid, people, coming from an immigrant family, my parents were born here, but all four of my grandparents were from Sparta. And if somebody in our family married outside of the Greek community, they say, "Oh, she married American boy," because they knew that somebody who was not part of our ethnic group was an American. What else would he be? He's not Italian. He's not Polish. He's not Jewish. He's not Greek. He's an American. If you ask an American that, he doesn't know the answer to the question. He doesn't have an answer to what he is ethnically any different from anybody else who happens to have a U.S. birth certificate. And I think that's a part of our problem. Not so much that people like me don't know who we are, but people like you don't know who they are.
when I was talking to my friend, um, I was talking about the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
She's from Canada and she has kids. So I was like, all right, so let's just do a thought experiment. Let's say your kids have kids and their kids have kids, and it goes on like that for like 500 years, and they're all in Canada. Would your descendants 500 years from now be considered indigenous? She was like, no. And I was like, 100,000 years. He's like, no, I'm like a million years. And then she just got upset and the conversation ended. But I was like,
Yeah.
and I was like, well, wait a minute. Like the people that you're saying are indigenous, if you trace back their ancestors, eventually at some point you're not in Canada or North
Yeah.
America. Like you're in
Yeah.
Africa. So
Yeah.
like, what does indigenous mean? And I'm
Or
reminded of what
yeah. Yeah.
one of our writers at the Institute, Brad Pierce, um, who he goes by the Wayward Rabbler.
Mm-hmm.
The way he put it to me was indigenous just means that when the anthropologists showed up, they weren't impressed. That's what it means. Yeah. So no matter how long our descendants are in America, um, they'll never be indigenous.
And you could take that a step further, say, okay, you're not indigenous, but these people here, they call them First Nations in Canada. This tribe over here that lives in this locality, are they indigenous? Yes, yes, they are. Really? What about the tribe that lived there before them, before they pushed them out? Were they indigenous? How about the tribe that lived there before them, before they pushed them out? Were they indigenous? How about before that, when they came over from Siberia? Were they, who's indigenous then? I mean, what makes you indigenous? What wave of who pushed whom out makes you indigenous? Have you ever heard of the Dorset culture?
I have not.
That's because they're extinct. They were people who lived in they sometimes call them a paleo Eskimo culture. They lived in what is now northern Canada, and the people we now call Eskimos, or they call them some Inuit, who came originally over from Siberia, gradually pushed them out, pushed them out, pushed them out, pushed them out. I guess they had a more robust Arctic technology than the Dorset people did. So they kept getting pushed onto more and more marginal land, and they eventually disappeared. I think the last person believed to be of the Dorset culture died about 200, 250 years ago. They're extinct now. Interestingly enough, Eskimo DNA shows, excuse me, Inuit DNA shows no traceable Dorset ancestry. So there seems to be very little mixing. I mean, I suppose somebody might want to accuse them of genocide, but I wouldn't go that far.
Well, it's funny in American discourse, if you point domestically, if you point out, say, any disparities between racial groups,
Mm-hmm.
people a lot of people will immediately get upset and they'll be like, that's because of culture,
Yeah.
which is funny. So they're accepting the premise that there's these disparities. So like the ideology, they didn't embrace it fully because you're supposed to say
Yeah.
there's no differences, but they're like, no, it's because of culture. But then if you're like, I don't think we should let incompatible cultures into the United States, they'll be like, that's racist. Like, oh, you are saying that culture has something to do with race? I think you're the racist one, dude.
There you go. That's culturist.
Culturist. So about 2 years ago, I went and I saw uh, Scott Horton debate Eli Lake about the um, the Russian war in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and the debate question was something like, the war was provoked, and Scott's saying it was, and Eli is saying it wasn't, and it was hosted by Reason Magazine. Now I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Jim,
Mm-hmm.
but this was at a college, and so it was mostly college kids in the audience, and I was there because I'm friends with Scott.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was this group of like middle-aged Ukrainian women
Mm-hmm.
that were just there, and like a lot of them, maybe like 10 or 20 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part after, and it's a Oxford style debate. So the audience can ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And these Ukrainian women got up and they just went off on Scott. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing they kept saying was like, have you been to Ukraine? Like, have you been there?
Yeah.
You know? And he's like, no, I haven't been there. And the thing is, I know that like Scott's books are really about like America
Yeah.
and the empire.
Yeah.
So his first book, Fool's Errand, it's not really about Afghanistan. It's about America's war in Afghanistan.
Exactly. Yes.
And the same thing with Provoked. I mean, it does go into a lot of the history of
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like he definitely could, if they weren't, if this war had never happened and he just met them in a bar and was just talking to them about Ukraine, they'd be really impressed and touched by his knowledge of their country.
Yeah. Yeah.
But because there's all these historical hatreds and enmities and ideologies clashing with each other, they see themselves as the like center of the story, and they just can't see that no, this is great power, a great power contest.
Mm-hmm.
Moscow versus DC, and you're caught in the middle, just like you were the last time.
Yeah. 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 It's sort of like the eternal using of the Kurds for some fool's mission that they always get betrayed at the end and they wonder, gosh, it happened again. I mean, there's a certain modus operandi to Washington. When you mentioned Milosevic from the Yugoslav wars a while back, I was actually the second defense witness he called at his trial at The Hague. And what I testified on was obviously not on events on the ground in the Balkans, but what was going on in Washington in terms of policy making. I mean, one of the charges against him was that in no later than October of 1998, he had been the initiator of a criminal conspiracy to ethnically cleanse the Albanians from Kosovo. And there was no direct evidence of that charge. There was no written order. There was nobody who would testify to an oral order. It was all extrapolating from events. Well, there must have been a conspiracy to do this based on events. And what I testified about was, no later than August of 1998, 2 months before the alleged criminal conspiracy of which he was accused, there had already been a decision made in Washington to attack Serbia over Kosovo as soon as a suitable pretext could be found. And the evidence for that was a paper I issued from the Senate in August 1998 saying exactly that. The Clinton administration has already decided to attack Serbia. All they're looking for is a pretext. And that was already clear in Washington at that time from unclassified sources. And so, yeah, am I an expert on everything that happened in the Balkans at that time? No. If I got a pretty good insight as to what happens in Washington and how people think in Washington and how decisions are made in Washington, yeah, I think I got a pretty fair hunch on that.
How much of the decision to attack the Serbs was based on the Serbs' relationship with the Russians?
That was a huge part of it. Back to what I said earlier, if our goal at the time was to maintain dominance of the world, which means starting with the dominance of Europe, that means maintaining NATO dominance in Europe, keeping the Russians in a box and showing that we can crush this little country, Serbia, as an object lesson to the Russians, and that you have to back up a little bit. In the early 1990s, there was an absolute terror in Washington that the Europeans would decide they didn't need us anymore. You remember, that there was in the mid 1990s there was talk of something called Eurocorps, that the European Union was going to form its own military arm. They could handle their own security affairs. They didn't need NATO anymore. And I think one of the things that scared us was when the Bosnian crisis broke out. The French and the British rapidly put forces into Bosnia as the mainstays of a UN stabilization force to stop the fighting with tacit Russian support. In other words, the three powers that had been allied with us in World War II wanted to stabilize the situation, especially since the Slovenia and Croatian crisis had been kicked off with a lot of German support. So you already had a little bit of the reappearance of some of the tensions within Europe that had existed in the previous decades. That the Americans did not like that because that meant that the Europeans could settle a peace problem in Europe on their own without us. And we didn't like that, so that's why we came in both feet in supporting support of the Muslims. In fact, we were allied with the Iranians and do that. There was a whole thing what they called the Iranian arms pipeline coming through Croatia to arm the Bosnian Muslims in violation of UN Security Council resolutions on an arms embargo in Bosnia. We had C-130s flying covert flights into Bosnia to give weapons to the Muslims. Which was very convenient because we had the AWACS planes that were monitoring the embargo, so we knew exactly when to fly our planes with, so they wouldn't be monitored by our own planes. So that we were basically, and look, British and French soldiers, our allies, got killed by some of our Muslim proxies in the Balkans because we had to assert our mastery there. So in other words, I would say that the wars in the Balkans were an object lesson to the Russians, but also a lesson to our European satellites. Don't start thinking of big ideas here. Like you can handle things without us. We'll come in and be the fireman who could put this fire out. Don't you think you can do it? So
We're
they
the
and
line leader.
huh?
We're the line leader.
Yeah, exactly. You just shut up and do what you're told, and that's the way it was. There were a lot of funny things. I can remember I was part of a staff delegation in NATO headquarters in when was it? I'm trying to think of what it was. Well, during the Kosovo War, but I was there at an early. Oh, I know this was actually in 1992. This was not to NATO headquarters and also in Germany. And I remember a French diplomat at the European Union talking about the EU. Was back then was the European Community, the EC, decision to recognize Slovenia and Croatia when they declared independence in June of 1991. Everybody in Europe was against it except for the Germans because everybody else was afraid it was going to kick off a war. And so they're all opposed to recognizing this, whereas the Germans had been helping those republics prepare for those declarations for years. And then after Germany was united, they saw this was their moment to move. I still don't know why they did that. You'd think they'd be too busy putting Germany back together again to bother with the Balkans. But anyway, they insisted to the other European countries that if they did not join them in unanimously recognizing Slovenia and Croatia's independence, that they would do it on their own. And for the sake of European unity, the other 11 went along with it. And in fact, I can remember the French diplomat, he had this great accent. He says, and so the vote in the EC was 11-1, and the one won. And then, and of course, and then what happened next was the Bosnia, that you had the question of what was going to happen to Bosnia. And the Americans up to that point had not recognized Slovenia and Croatia, but the Europeans did not want to recognize the independence of Bosnia. And Washington told the Europeans, we'll make a deal with you. And we'll recognize Slovenia and Croatia if you will join us in recognizing Bosnia. And then everything blew up.
I mean, that makes me think of in the Iliad where Zeus is arguing with um Hera, and she's like, I think I'm remembering this correctly. She's like, I like Troy. You can't destroy Troy. And then he's like, all right, we can destroy the three cities you want me to destroy if I can destroy Troy. And they're just like trading cities.
we're,
DC's like, yeah,
we're
we'll
just
recognize
playthings for the
these.
gods.
Yeah. Or these are like basically like DC sees itself as this god,
Yeah, yeah,
basically. This is Mount Olympus. This Mount Olympus on the hill. So when it comes to the special military
yeah.
operation, I wonder if you could give your thoughts on a few things about that. Um, one, why Russia made the decision to. It wasn't really a full scale invasion. Some
No,
military
no.
analysts would say, but why they made the decision to do that, why they did it, uh, the way that they did it, what's been going on since then, and then really just from my perspective, is like, why have they not at this point just leveled Kiev? Why is Kiev still standing?
Well, they don't need to level Kiev in a sense of destroying the whole city, but if you mean level Kiev in terms of destroying the command and control, the government apparatus, the presidential administration, the SBU, which is the Ukrainian KGB, the GUR, which is military intelligence, all of the organs that make the Ukrainian state function. Yeah, they could do that, and I've been puzzling over that for some time, and honestly, I don't have a good answer. Why haven't they destroyed the bridges over the Dnieper? So that they can't supply their army in the east? Why do they not destroy the rail lines, bringing in more material from Poland? It looks like they're beginning to shut down the port in Odessa, Nikolaev, and so forth to prevent material from coming in by sea. We'll have to see whether they follow through with that. In other words, why are they not fighting this war as though they intended to win it? And that's the big question. And I think we have to go back. At the time of the Maidan revolution of dignity, as they called it, the glory Victoria Nuland handing out the cookies and all that stuff, the snipers on the roof of
And the
the
sandwiches.
yeah. Oh, don't forget the
Don't
sandwiches.
forget about the sandwiches, kid.
Yeah, were they salo sandwiches? Do you ever had salo? It's
No, I have no idea what kind of sandwiches they were.
Salo is a favorite Ukrainian food. It's pork fat, highly seasoned pork fat. It's kind of yummy actually. Anyway, neither here nor there. I'm getting a little hungry thinking about it. Anyway, and also you had snipers on the roof of the Ukraine what is it Dnipro hotel, shooting at police and protesters alike to keep the pot stirred. There all sorts of nasty stuff was going on. Anyway, Putin had offered then President Yanukovych a blank check. I have it on good authority. He basically told him, do what you need to do to restore order, and we will give you every resource you need. Pretty much, by the way, what he did with the president of Kazakhstan a couple of years ago, when there was almost a color revolution in Kazakhstan, and that was beaten back. Not that different from what happened with Erdogan when he saved Erdogan's bacon. Well, I guess couldn't be bacon because that's not halal. But anyway, he saved his bacon a few years ago.
Western
And
backed.
pardon?
Was that coup Western backed? The one in Turkey.
I think so. There were a lot of the usual suspects in Washington that were cheering it on because I think they wanted to see a Kemalist secular government come back into power instead of an Islamist government, which is Erdogan. And it had something to do with, I can't remember the guy's name now. This guy who used to be very close to Erdogan, he runs a string of very influential schools, including he's based here in the United States now. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was involved in it at some point as well. Um, anyway, Yanukovych didn't take his advice. He thought by trying to work with the Europeans and the Americans and agreeing to a compromise with the opposition, he could find some way to stabilize the situation, hold early elections, which they then would surely lose. But still, the state would hold together. And of course, that deal didn't hold. I mean, the very day, rather night, it was signed, it was violated by the opposition forces. They took over Kiev. Yanukovych fled to the eastern part of the country and then from there to Russia, and that was all over. So the Maidan forces took over the country. At that point, Putin acted to secure the Crimea because that was the home of the Black Sea Fleet. And again, the pro-Russian sentiment there was overwhelming. And in fact, even a huge part of the Ukrainian fleet went over to the Russian side. They simply changed uniforms from the Ukrainian Navy to the Russian Navy. Things were a little more complicated and on the in the land provinces, particularly in Donetsk and Lugansk. But again, most of the opinion there was very strongly pro-Russian. In fact, they declared their independence from Ukraine and wanted to be recognized by Russia as independent from Ukraine and then join Russia. And Putin said no. And that's when he entered into the Minsk agreement after a lot of fighting then, which, as we know from Hollande and Merkel and people like that, was always a ruse from the point of view of the Western powers, just to gain time to stabilize the Ukrainian state and to militarize it. Despite 8 years, what is it? How many years was it from 2015 to 2022? And repeated shelling by the Ukrainians into the Donbass areas held by the secessionists, which Putin refused to recognize as independent. The Russians kept trying to get the West to implement the Minsk agreements that allowed for direct negotiations between the Kiev authorities and the Donbass authorities over autonomy, over decentralization, over recognition of Russian language rights, and things of that sort. Kiev refused to negotiate with them, would not implement any part of the agreement that was signed because they had no intention to from the beginning. They were simply preparing. What they wanted to prepare was something like the Operation Storm that occurred in the Krajina areas of Croatia in 1995, where they basically just attacked them and drove the whole Serbian population out of those areas where they'd been for hundreds and hundreds of years. They weren't indigenous, though. They were like Europeans in Canada. They were not really indigenous. Um,
Colonizers.
the colonized, well, actually, what they were was, at least in the Serbian case, they were existing what had been what they called a militar grenze of the Austrian Empire. They were in areas that had been depopulated by repeated Ottoman raids along the Austrian border. And Serbs, largely from Kosovo, actually had been settled as refugees in these areas as kind of like a military class to protect the border. And they had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years in that capacity. But then they were finally driven out in 1995. That's a little side note. Anyway, they were preparing that kind of Operation Storm against the Donbass. And 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 I don't know when that would have been launched. Probably not too much long. If the Russian special military operation had not begun in February 2022, I suspected that attack on the Donbass would have occurred sometime in 2022, maybe 2023. I'm not sure how soon, but it was in preparation. And remember, before they came in with their special military operation, I keep putting that quotes because it sounds so stupid, is that they presented these two draft treaties, one to the United States and one to NATO, about a European-wide security architecture, which also would have included neutrality for Ukraine and things of that sort. And of course, this was under the Biden administration, and they said they would not even talk about. You'd think, even if you didn't even want to think the treaties had no merits, whatever, if the other major nuclear power says this is a serious security concern we have, and we would like to talk about these treaties, you think you'd say, okay, fine, let's talk. You send a delegation to someplace, we'll send a delegation, we'll look it over, we'll give you our thoughts. At least you do them the courtesy of taking their views seriously. Just saying, no, nothing to talk about, which is the attitude we took. And of course, then they launched the special military operation. The reason I say it's stupid is that just as it was the case with NATO expansion, just as was the case with Minsk, just for that matter was the case with the Security Council Resolution 1244 in 1999 over the status of Kosovo, the Russians have been lied to umpteen times, and each time they sit there afterward with their thumb stuck in there and say, "Duh, they lied to us again." I mean, what is the matter with these people? I don't get it. And apparently, what they thought, and they, everybody knows in 2022, you say you're right. It was not a full scale invasion. It was actually a relatively small force. They thought, evidently, well, they thought two things. One is that everybody would greet them with bread and salt when they went in, welcome those liberators, throw flowers at them. And I think a lot of people were very happy they were there, but they were also uncertain. Are you guys going to stay? Because we saw in many cases when the Russians did pull out and the Ukrainians came back, there were real reprisals against the people there. They accused of being pro-Russian or collaborating with the Russians. So if you're in a situation there, even if you want the Russians to come, you can be very, very careful. You're not going to be throwing any salt or flowers or bread. You're going to say, okay, yeah, okay, and just sort of mind your own business if you don't know what's going to happen next. So anyway, they came in with this very minimal force with the idea of saying, now you could see we're serious. Will you meet our terms and talk about our draft treaties? What? No. And then they even pull back their force. Say, oh, the Ukrainians drove them back from the gates of Kiev. No, they didn't. The Russians pulled back. As soon as there was talk about a possible agreement, and they pulled back, and then of course they met in Istanbul, first in Minsk and then in Istanbul. They said, we've already agreed. We've got the outlines of an agreement here. And then Boris Yeltsin went over. I mean, it's not Boris Yeltsin, Boris Johnson, a different Boris, went over in there and scuttled the whole thing. Again, I think the Russians fooling themselves that they thought, oh, gee, we almost had an agreement in Istanbul. And now I think what they've been doing over and over again is to say, okay, we can turn up the heat a little bit, turn up the heat a little bit. Now we agree to our terms. Now we agree to our terms. And they seem to be absolutely puzzled that we don't want to. Why would we? Because like we said earlier in the thing, we may be losing 10 Ukrainians, but we're killing one Russian. Let's just keep killing that Russian. The Ukrainians, we got Ukrainians to spare. And when we're done with Ukrainians, we'll find some Poles or Hungarians or something.
Germans.
Germans, yeah, they're all expendables. What the hell? I mean, it's we'll fight we'll fight to the last Ukrainian life and the last European euro until we start shipping them out there to die too. And they seem to be dumb enough to be up to the task, at least from what their governments are saying. Anyway, maybe now look, a lot of people are saying that Russia's mentality is changing and they're going to shut down the Black Sea ports. They're going to start fighting the war with no gloves off. I've heard this many, many times. I remember after Starobelsk when all those schoolgirls got killed. I guess it was a couple months ago by Ukrainian missile or drone or whatever it was. We had a lot of the smart guys in the dissident media saying, "Okay, that's it. The Russians are going to destroy all the command centers in Kiev, and the gloves are off, et cetera, et cetera." Of course, that didn't happen, and I don't know that it will happen. From every look, you still have people there in Moscow saying officially we are still committed to the understandings at Anchorage. What understandings at Anchorage? I mean, at least the Iranians have figured out you can't make an agreement with these gangsters. How come the Russians can't figure that out? Now, maybe they're not serious about that. Maybe they've decided they need to win this war on the ground, win it militarily, and they're just going through the motions of diplomatic talk to say yes, yes, we're open to an agreement. But they know that that's not going to happen, and maybe they will switch their war fighting mode over to one that looks like it ends like Berlin 1914, not 1945. But I'll believe when I see it. And by the
I
way,
mean,
I'm not saying this because I'm cheering for the Russians, because I am sympathetic to the point of view. I'm sympathetic to the point of view of Ukraine, not the Ukrainian regime, but of Ukraine as a country. I get very upset when I hear some of my Russian friends saying, "Oh, okay, that's it. Ukrainians have made their choice. Now they're going to have to suffer." When did the Ukrainians make their choice? They voted for Zelensky because he promised them peace versus the former president Poroshenko. who promised them more war. Of course, they voted for peace. I voted for Donald Trump because he promised peace. I didn't get peace, right?
Now, speaking of Donald Trump and not getting peace, in the war against America and Israel's war against Iran, um, they've gone in a few times with attacks, but this most recent uh, kickoff of hostilities in February, they went in and just decapitated the regime.
Yeah.
But that didn't win the war.
No.
So if if Russia went in like America and just took out Zelensky and Beletsky and all the top guys and all the command centers, would that also not end the war? Or could they collapse the state
I
in a
think
way
they
that
could. I think they could collapse the state. I think that for the reasons of the not only the Islamic ideology of the Iranian state, but also the fact that they have been anticipating this for a very long time. They have decentralized the structure of their government. I think they've got a lot of, as I understand it, for virtually every position of any significance. They know if one is gone, who is number two, who succeeds him, and if he's gone, who's number three, who succeeds him. That they've got, interchangeable parts who can step into those shoes when it's necessary. I don't know that that kind of redundancy exists in the Ukrainian state. I mean, I'm sure there are divisions inside the Iranian structures, but Ukraine has, even in the current regime, is a snake pit with a lot of rivalries, and I just don't see that it could survive that kind of decapitation. And I'm thinking more in terms of not only the personalities involved, but how they manage the war. You know the I don't think Iran, for example, has suffered anything like the human attrition and material attrition. I mean that Ukraine has. I mean, maybe they're grabbing people off the street of Tehran and throwing them in the buses, like we see in all these films in Ukraine. But I think Ukraine is a lot closer to the breaking point than Iran is.
mentioned one of our writers at the Institute, Brad Pierce, and he had sort of a funny analogy. He referenced this show. Um, can't think of the name, but it's by the guy that did The Simpsons. And it's a show that takes place in like space. It's a cartoon.
What's him Groening or something? Matt Groening?
Yeah, Matt Groening.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember the name of the show at the moment.
Hmm.
Oh, Futurama. It's
Yeah,
called
Futurama. Sure.
Futurama.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah.
And there's an episode apparently where the protagonists go to some planet that's run by robots, and the robot ruling council, uh, part of its propaganda is to demonize humans. And they make up all sorts of stories about humans, like humans can breathe fire and they can fly around and all this stuff. And the protagonists get to talk to the like ruling council, who admits to these humans that some of them are human, admits to these some humans that yeah, we know humans aren't like the demons that we portray them as. And to be honest, like we have been telling these lies for so long, we're actually not, we don't know what's true and false about humans anymore. But the reason we do it is because it distracts the population from like internal domestic economic troubles.
Yeah.
And he was like, there were probably a lot of people in Iran who felt that way about their government.
Hmm.
Yeah, you demonize the Americans because you want to distract me from your power and your missteps that have led to economic, sure, blame the sanctions, you know. But then we showed up and proved
Improved
the
the
propaganda is right.
propaganda. Yeah. Yeah.
We killed their leader with like half his family. We hit a school. I'm saying we, just like our, nation,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and killed all these little girls. And so now that's how uh, that's how they view Americans. And we talked about uh, NATO in the Balkans and in
Mhm.
Kosovo. And
Yeah.
there's an anti-NATO propaganda poster that I saw from the 90s, and it's like It's like basically like a U.S. soldier with like it says NATO on him, and he's like shoving his bayonet into a little girl, like holding her up. And it's like, damn, that's what they think of us. And like, yeah, that's what they think of us, like with good reason, not just made up.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, but that's not all of us. And so it's really been an honor having you on my show and talk about your experiences and give uh, your perspective on what's going on in Ukraine. But do you have any sort of closing thoughts about uh, where we stand now with the situation in Ukraine? I've seen some reports that Zelensky and his inner circle are planning on trying to negotiate by the end of the year. And I see other reports that, yeah, Russia's going to take Kiev. Obviously, we can't predict the future, but where do you see
yeah.
these trends?
Short answer is I don't know. I think it depends on decisions being made in Moscow. And as far as I can tell, despite some other smart guys who are saying to the contrary, I do think that the primary objective still of Mr. Putin personally, if not others, is to come to an agreement with somebody. And you know, I wrote a piece in December 2024, before Trump had been elected, but before he took office, saying that a lot of people are investing hopes that he's going to negotiate again an end to this war. And I explained why. He can't do that because the United States can never make an agreement in good faith with anybody. And the only thing we can offer the Russians is a deception, which is what we offer the Iranians as well. And that we will try to do is to tell the Russians that, sure, sure, we'll meet your minimum demands. Crimea, the four oblasts, will promise demilitarizations, denazification, and neutrality for Ukraine. And of course, we will not follow through on any of those obligations. So at this point, I think what the West needs to do after they get tired of expending Ukrainians and killing however many Russians they can is to preserve as much of Ukraine as they can as a NATO state, which in effect is what it is. And by the way, let's not forget, it became a NATO military under the first Trump term. It was under Trump 1 that Ukraine became a NATO state in all but name, that was built up into this NATO army in essence. So let's not let him off the hook. It wasn't just Joe Biden. So that's again another reason why the Russians are fooling themselves if they think they can negotiate with this crowd. And in any case, I think that would be what the goal would be. At some point, when things are getting desperate from Kiev, rather than let the whole state collapse, they'll say, "Fine, fine, we'll meet your terms." Hey, the agreement at Anchorage was irresponsibly uh, generous from Moscow's point of view. Pull out of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, which they're close to capturing completely now anyway, and freeze the line of contact in Zaporozhye and Kherson, the other two oblasts that the Russians claim, and then rely on what? Paper guarantees to accomplish neutrality, denazification. Well, they'll have new elections in Kiev and they'll eliminate the more radical. Oh, sure. I mean, they can make all sorts of promises and not keep them, just like they did in the past. And let's be clear: as soon as there's a ceasefire, there will be European troops that go into Ukraine, and at that point, I don't know what's going to happen, John. A lot of people now have been talking about how these two theaters of what is increasingly looking like a global war are starting to merge. That we're talking about a single war now with two theaters, the Iranian theater and the Ukrainian theater. And look, my concern is that unless the Russians insist on a military solution to this war, which which either means the end of the Ukrainian state or the creation of a Ukrainian rump state, kind of like a second Belarus, with a puppet government controlled by Moscow. Anything less than that is simply setting the stage for the next bigger war. Just as the ceasefire in 2015 and the Minsk agreement set the stage for this war, and that's what my real concern is. I think there are a lot, and that's where I do fault Moscow a lot for the way they fought this war as a war of attrition. There's one analyst, very sympathetic to the Russian side, says, "Oh no, the Russians are winning by attrition. They're killing off Ukraine's sperm bank. The way they're going to win this war is kill every man in Ukraine." What kind of way is that to fight a war against people you're related to? And by the way, losing a lot of your own people in the process too. I know that's just not only militarily senseless and unnecessary. Look, the only way General Grant was going to get to Richmond was through Lee. He had to fight a war of attrition. Grant didn't have Oreshnik missiles. He couldn't strike at Jeff Davis and his people. And by the way, I'm not saying I'm necessarily sympathetic to Mr. Lincoln's war, but I'm just saying from a military point of view, there was no other way to fight that war if you wanted to win. The Russians don't need to be fighting the war this way from a military point of view. And now people will give you all sorts of rationales why this is better. I don't buy any of them. I think it's a political decision because they're still expecting somebody to come negotiate with them because I think deep down they don't understand the mentality of people in Washington or in the Western governments. Back to what we said at the beginning of the show. They don't understand these people have a Gnostic Manichean mindset where they are the embodiment of absolute good, and the Russians or the Iranians, whoever, the North Koreans, are the embodiment of absolute evil. And the only acceptable outcome is you must be destroyed. I don't think the Russians fully understand that. So they still think we live in the era of classic diplomacy where, okay, finally now let's get down to brass tacks, do a little horse trading. Sure, neutrality of Austria, that's a great idea. We can all agree on that. Neutrality of Ukraine, we can all agree on that. Great idea. That's never going to happen. Even if we were to agree to such a thing, which is virtually impossible, we'd have our fingers crossed behind our back and we would not abide by the agreement. I don't think they really understand that in Moscow.
Not good.
No, it's not. And again, it's not so much for them or for the Ukrainians or for the Europeans. I'm mostly worried about the United States because hey, I got kids, I got grandkids. I don't want to see everybody, disappear. And what's the temperature in a nuclear blast? I don't know. Hey,
Hotter than the sun.
people used to worry about when the atomic scientist clock got close to midnight. Now nobody gives a damn.
Well, they haven't nuked us yet. So DC's the lesson learned in DC is we can just keep doing what we're doing.
Well, it's I hope I'm out of the blast zone.
Me too. Jim, thank you so much. Could you show your book again?
Yeah, sure. I
I
tried to warn you.
tried to warn you.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for coming on my show
yeah.
and warning us again.
Yeah, with
And
uh,
I
with
encourage
with with endorsements from Ron Paul and Colonel Douglas McGregor and all sorts of great people. So
as soon as we hang up, I'm gonna buy that book, and I encourage everyone in the audience to buy it and read it as well.
thank you. Oh, just for the record, that cigarette is tobacco, and the first one is 2023. The first one I'd smoked since 1962.
That's awesome.
My next one will be in
Any
2084.
anything for the photo shoot. I love it.
Actually, no, that was just a picture. And I said, hey, it's a good picture. I'll put that on my book.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for coming on my show. Hopefully,
thank you.
I can get you back sometime
Love
later
to.
this year to talk about the hopefully better developments.
Like we say in
But
Spanish, I am disposable.
as am I, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Good night.
Good night.